Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 67 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Happy Groundhog's Day! If you're like me and you live in a region with cold temperatures, you're probably wondering when winter will end. But I wouldn't rely too much on what Punxsutawney Phil has to say. During my last year at Penn State, I convinced a couple of friends that we should wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and drive the 2 hours out to Punxsutawney so that we could witness the Groundhog's Day festivities from a top gobbler's knob. About 30 or 40 minutes before we saw Phil, the organizers of the event launched fireworks. Then they turned on these bright stage lights and brought out Phil. I have no idea how Phil avoided seeing his shadow. Regardless of whether or not we have more winter forecasted for us today, I can promise you that today's episode will put you in a spring state of mind. Today, we will explore the early American histories of California and Hawaii. Our guide for this exploration, John Ryan Fischer, author of Cattle Colonialism, an environmental history of the conquest of California and Hawaii. During our exploration, Ryan reveals what environmental history is and what it can teach us about the past. Native American culture in both California and Hawaii before and after European contact, and how both the landscapes and Native Americans in California and Hawaii responded to the European introduction of Spanish longhorn cattle. But first, if you have joined the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook, thank you. I can honestly say that you make my days more enjoyable. I really enjoy our daily conversations and how our interactions have provided us with a way to get to know each other better. If you would like to join in on the fun, text BFWorld to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com and click on the big orange Join Now button on the right-hand sidebar. Are you ready to visit California and Hawaii and learn more about their early American past? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a visiting professor of history at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. His research interests include environmental history, U.S. colonial history, and borderlands history. He has just published his first book, Cattle Colonialism, an environmental conquest of California and Hawaii. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, John Ryan Fischer.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks for having me on.
Ryan, I'm intrigued by your research interests. When most historians say that they're interested in U.S. colonial history, they mean that they're interested in the 13 colonies. However, you are curious about a different type of colonial history. Would you tell us how you came to study the colonial history of California and Hawaii?
I actually made the decision to start Chapter 1 in 1776. I picked that date. It wasn't necessarily the most obvious starting point, but I thought it reinforced that this is the greater North American context of what we often think of when we think about the American colonies. So yeah, I got very interested in California and Hawaii. I really started as an undergrad, and I really got interested in them as an outsider, which as an environmental historian, I don't know if I would recommend. I think being familiar with a landscape, it gives you a sort of advantage. You know, it doesn't hurt to know the environment you're talking about. But I grew up in the Midwest. I had never been to California when I first started researching California, but something about it fascinated me. It has such an interesting history of environmental change and such a diversity of peoples. And that interaction of culture and environmental change really fascinated me. So I logged on to California as an undergrad, wrote my senior thesis about it, decided to go to graduate school in California. The first time I got to California was I was looking for housing as a graduate student. And then when I was in California, I had never been to Hawaii, but I got interested in Hawaii. And I was looking for a topic about California environmental history, and I read about ranching in Hawaii and how cattle from California had gone over to Hawaii and established the ranching industry there. And people who live in Hawaii know that there's a ranching industry in Hawaii and know that it has this rich history. The Hawaiian Cowboys, or Paniolo, are a big part of Hawaiian culture. And once I started to research it, I met people. Someone I knew since I was a child, her father actually was a Paniolo. So people are very aware of that world, but it was something that surprised me as someone who had never been to Hawaii, that there was this ranching industry and this cattle culture. So I got fascinated in that. I was also interested in the idea of introduced species. I was in a really great program funded by the National Science Foundation about introduced species. So cattle in California and Hawaii seemed like a great way to explore that topic, to learn about new places, and to look at an area of colonial history that maybe doesn't get as much focus as it should.
It's funny, having grown up in New England, people in New England are fascinated by California, but it's mostly because they envision it as a place with like the perfect weather where it never snows and the temperature is always great. But Hawaii, I'd never imagined cattle. I stereotypically imagine the pig at the pig roast.
Yeah, and I think we have a very tourist-centric view of Hawaii. I think even people who go to Hawaii as tourists might not see the cattle industry, even though when you start looking for it, it's everywhere. But you can visit Hawaii, I think, without really thinking about the cattle industry there, because it's not part of our sort of public imagination of Hawaii.
Before we look at the cattle culture in California and Hawaii and their early American history, you mentioned earlier that you're an environmental historian. This is our first episode about environmental history. Would you tell us what environmental historians study?
Sure. It's a big responsibility to be the spokesperson for environmental history. But basically, environmental history is incorporating what we would consider to be natural processes into the historical narrative. So looking at how people affect landscapes, soils, animals, climate, and how all those things affect people, I think is the most basic way of defining environmental history.
Okay, now let's turn to those landscapes. What did the landscapes and societies of both California and Hawaii look like before Europeans arrived? And when did Europeans arrive? What is the time period we're talking about here when we examine this question?
Well, California was extremely diverse, both in its landscapes and in its people before Europeans arrived. You have the Sierra Nevada mountains, very tall mountains that usually, when there's not a horrible drought, have thick snowpacks. You have the Central Valley, which is extremely flat, has good soils, but maybe not enough water. You have the coastal mountains, you have deserts. There's a lot of different environments. And perhaps because of that, there are also a lot of different indigenous people who settle in California. There are 7 different language families spoken in California before Europeans arrived. That's out of 10 or a dozen total in North America. And you had hundreds of different languages, hundreds of different peoples, really. Overall population of about 300,000, which is a very dense population, especially considering that they didn't practice agriculture. A lot of people were living by gathering acorns, also a lot of hunting and fishing going on there. They didn't have any big domestic animals, no livestock really. And then in Hawaii, you have a slightly different situation where you have a more unified culture. Polynesians migrate to Hawaii about 1,500 years ago, and they set up an agricultural regime that they bring with them, with taro or tallow in Hawaiian as a staple crop, They also bring Polynesian pigs, so they do have a bit more livestock experience. And each island sort of has its own set of chiefly rulers before Europeans arrive. The Spanish claimed California for a long time, going back to the establishment of New Spain, which is basically Mexico today. They claim it for a very long time, but they don't really establish a colony until 1769. And they do that because they're worried about other European powers moving into California, the British especially, and the Russians. And so they established a set of missions in 1769. Hawaii has its first recorded encounter with Europeans in 1778 with Captain Cook, the British explorer. And that begins a process of contact and change there.
What attracted the English to Hawaii and the Russians and Spanish to California?
California, it's interesting. There isn't a lot initially to bring people to California. That's sort of why it takes the Spanish so long to establish a colony there. There are some furs, which are what's really attracting the Russians. And then the Spanish are really just there to counter the Russians. So the Spanish are claiming this land for, some sort of hopeful future use, but they don't have a lot of direct ideas about what they're going to do with it other than convert the Indians, which I guess is the other big attraction for the Spanish, is that there are souls that they can convert. Hawaii, the big attraction of Hawaii is where it is. It's right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the North Pacific, and it is sort of midway between North America and Asia, and it's sort of a perfect place to stop for provisions, eventually for refueling, but that's not really an issue in the age of sail. But I think that's what, when Captain Cook sees these islands, I think that's what he immediately latches onto as their value, is that this is a place where the British can extend their control of the Pacific by having a friendly place to stop and get provisions for their ships that are going to be increasingly operating there.
Is the need for provisions why both the Spanish and the English wish to colonize Hawaii and California respectively with animals?
Yeah, that's an important thing. That's an important use initially of the cattle, is that they provide beef. And beef is a familiar food for Europeans, a sort of staple meat for Europeans. And so they are very keen on having that available to them. The Spanish have kind of established a pattern of bringing cattle into the places they go in the New World to have that food resource. And it's a mobile food resource, so you can take a large herd with you, and it is a low labor food resource in that the Spanish longhorns are pretty good at taking care of themselves. And so you don't necessarily need a ton of people to take care of them. They'll feed themselves. They'll do a decent job of protecting themselves. And so it's a very valuable, low labor food source for the Spanish. The same thing is true with the English and others in Hawaii, is they want to have beef when they stop for provisions. That's something that is familiar to them. It's something that's very common on ship provisions. So it's something that they're very keen, and it is Captain Vancouver who brings cattle from California to Hawaii. He had been on Cook's mission, and then he leads a mission of his own. He sort of has that in mind. He's very keen on it. If you read his journals, having cattle in Hawaii as a resource for other sailors, mostly English in his mind.
You mentioned that the cattle are hardy, that they're able to survive in these different environments and fend and take care of themselves. Did these Europeans ever try to introduce other animals, or was it just principally these Texas or Spanish longhorn cattle?
They introduced a lot of different animals. Sheep are another valuable animal for them. Pigs. Cook actually tries to introduce pigs to Hawaii, even though the Hawaiians already have pigs. which I think says something about the European mindset. Our pigs are the best pigs, and you should try our pigs. Goats, all these different animals are really part of the process. None of those animals yields quite as much meat as cattle, and none of them are quite as good, other than pigs maybe, none of them are quite as good at taking care of themselves as cattle. Sheep especially are going to require a lot more attention. In California, the bears are going to go after sheep. They're a little bit more reluctant to go after these Spanish longhorns with these giant weapons on their heads. The other animal that they introduced that's very important is the horse, which is more important for transportation, of course, and also for managing the cattle. So that is going to be a big part of their colonial efforts as well.
We've spoken with many historians who have told us all about how the presence of Europeans altered indigenous society. What role did the cattle play in altering the indigenous societies of California and Hawaii?
They played a lot of different roles. First of all, there is an environmental impact of the cattle. The cattle they graze, so they're going to be eating a lot of the vegetation throughout these places. They also bring with them invasive plant species. They end up sort of replacing the native plants with plants that are more useful to them. So they'll eat the native plants, and then with them in their feed or stuck to them somewhere will be seeds of wild oats in California, for instance. And those plants are more evolved to these sort of grazing regimes, and they'll spread very quickly when cattle are introduced. So they're changing the environments, which means that Indians are going to have to adapt to that in California. In Hawaii, you have the additional problem that they're eating the native Hawaiians' crops. They'll go into the fields and just start eating everything and trampling everything. And so that's another way that the cattle impact their subsistence. There's also cultural transformations that come when the cattle are brought in. The Spanish, their style of colonialism really depends on the institution of the mission and bringing Indians into the mission, teaching them about Christianity, changing their lifestyles, really. It's not just a conversion, a religious conversion process. It is changing your entire way of life, the way Spanish see it. They want the Indians to adopt a more Western lifestyle. They see that as part and parcel of Christianity. So a lot of the Indians in California within the mission system are going to become cattlemen. They're going to have to take care of the cattle as part of the civilizing process. So that's another way in which cattle change their lives, is it becomes part of their work. And you have something a little similar in Hawaii, in that the Hawaiians very quickly begin to engage in selling beef to different sailors. They are quick to take up what Vancouver had imagined as Hawaii as this restocking station where sailors can buy beef. And so Hawaiians, not only are they trying to prevent cattle from eating all their crops or from chasing them around, which we actually have a lot of stories of, but they're also beginning to manage the cattle, take care of the cattle, and round up the cattle to slaughter and sell the beef.
Did the Native Americans, either the Native Californians, the Californios, or in Hawaii, try to resist these animals, or did they just adapt them into their lives?
It's really interesting to me, actually, that they don't do a lot to resist them. In California, we do have stories of Indians killing cattle, and I think that they were very quick to see that the Spanish depend on cattle for food, and that if they could kill this resource, maybe they can chase the Spanish out. But for whatever reason, maybe there's too many cattle, or maybe I suspect they see some potential in these animals, that these are animals that could be useful to them. They don't do a lot of that. They don't target cattle that much. And they're more likely to steal cattle than to kill them. And likewise, in Hawaii, you have very quickly the native Hawaiians deciding that this is a resource they can use. Something that happens between the visit of Captain Cook in 1778 and the visit of Captain Vancouver in 1793 is that a Hawaiian chief rises up and unites the islands under a single regime, and that's Kamehameha. And Kamehameha becomes the king of Hawaii, the United Islands. He begins to create a sovereign government, and as the sovereign leader, he has a lot of power over what's going to happen with these animals. And he decides to put a kapu, which is the Hawaiian version of a taboo, on killing the cattle. So Hawaiians are not allowed to kill cattle without very explicit permissions. And that lasts until the early 1800s. And they seem to abide by that. They choose not to because, I argue, because they see it as a valuable resource.
Did the Hawaiian kapu lead to overpopulation of cattle?
There seems to be some evidence that it did. The numbers seem to rise very quickly. There's not a formal census. There actually aren't a ton of sources on Hawaii for the first couple of decades. The Hawaiians don't have a written language, and the visitors of Hawaii aren't writing a lot about it other than a few select travel accounts. So we don't have great data here, but it seems by the early 1800s there are thousands of cattle, which is surprising because the original population is about 4. There are thousands, and they seem to be becoming more and more of a nuisance to the commoners who are worried about their crops. So I think there is good evidence that there is an overpopulation there, which is exacerbating these environmental changes and exacerbating the impact on a lot of the native Hawaiian planters.
I'd like for us to talk about how the native Hawaiians integrated cattle into their lives a bit more, but I think we need to put that on hold and talk about the rise of the California Vaquero, because that will inform, of course, what Hawaii ends up doing. So would you tell us about the rise and development of the California Vaquero?
So Vaquero is the Spanish word for cowboy, but the word has come to really take on a very specific meaning, referring to Mexican cowboys. This is the Mexican cattle culture. As the Spanish arrive in Mexico, they bring cattle with them, and cattle become an important economic resource in Mexico. So there is this whole Vaquero tradition that exists before the Spanish colonized California. And when they get to California, they bring that with them. And so I talked earlier about how the Indians are learning to take care of cattle in the missions, that is really the process of them learning this job, becoming Vaqueros. So it's really the Indians in California, and specifically the mission Indians, who are doing most of the cowboy work in California. And this involves very skilled riding of horses as you're chasing down cattle, and it also involves learning the lasso and being able to lasso cattle. All those sort of rodeo activities are taught to the Indians in the missions, and they seem to take to it really well. There are a lot of accounts of just how skilled Indian vaqueros are in California, and those go throughout the 19th century. You have stories about skilled Indian vaqueros.
How do the vaqueros differ from like the John Wayne type cowboys we picture in the American West and Southwest?
That's an interesting question. I think really the biggest difference is racial. The vaqueros are Mexican, they're mestizo, they're Indian, and as the sort of cowboy myth develops, there is a big emphasis on differentiating the Anglo-Saxon sort of frontier hero of the cowboy from these other racial groups. So in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, they make a very clear distinction between cowboys and vaqueros. And there are some slight differences in dress in style. But I think really the key difference is how these jobs get racially constructed.
So their jobs are basically the same. They're just racial categories in some ways.
Yeah, they're rounding up cattle and bringing them to get branded or slaughtered. That's pretty much what they do in both cases. I guess the sort of prototypical cowboy, the one thing you can add is the cattle drive, which is a more of a later phenomenon. But for the most part, they're doing very similar work.
In Cattle Colonialism, Ryan discusses how the California Vaqueros influenced the development of the Hawaiian Paniolos or Hawaiian Cowboys. Ryan, would you tell us about that development and influence? And perhaps you could do it by sharing the story of Joaquin Armas.
So this is something that very much comes from the native Hawaiians. And there's a lot of indigenous agency in this story that I think is really fascinating. The Hawaiian kingdom that Kamehameha developed, as it is continuing to develop, it's looking for resources. It's entering into global capitalism, and it's trying to stay afloat by selling what it can. And the leaders in Hawaii really decide to focus on cattle as a marketable resource. So initially they're hiring people, a lot of Australians, a lot of sailors who jump ship in Hawaii, which is a very common thing to do. They're hiring them to go kill cattle, to bring them hides and beef and tallow, which is rendered cattle fat, which is used for making candles and such. Eventually they decide in the 1830s to stop being so dependent on these bullock hunters, as they're called, that they're hiring, and train their own indigenous native Hawaiian cowboys. So to do that, they bring over Vaqueros from California because that's sort of the nearest source of this skilled labor. And the Vaquero who we have the best information about is this man from San Diego named Joaquin Armas. We have a lot of information because he ends up feeling like he got cheated by the Hawaiian government. And so he files a series of grievances, which is great for me because I can read all these grievances and read about the work he was doing. Clearly he's biased, but you can read between the lines and get an idea of how this worked. So basically what he does is he goes to the plains of Waimea, which is the biggest sort of ranching area. It's on the Big Island in Hawaii. It's a large grassland on the side of the mountain of Mauna Kea, the volcano of Mauna Kea. And he goes there and he rounds up cattle, collects the hides and tallow and beef for sale, but he has a bunch of native Hawaiian assistants. And as he works, he trains these assistants. The native Hawaiians call him a paniolo, which is a Hawaiianization of Espanol. So it's referring to his Spanishness, his Spanish heritage. But eventually that becomes sort of the catch-all term for Hawaiian cowboys. And this group of native Hawaiians that Joaquin Armas is training, we have a few other of these vaqueros who are training them as well. They also become extremely skilled, and they make their own, a few tweaks, a few adaptations to make the equipment and the style of cowboying work in Hawaii. And they create this cultural tradition and this heritage. And they also give the native Hawaiians an indigenous form of labor to manage the resource.
Another fascinating aspect of this cattle culture that Ryan discusses in Cattle Colonialism is the rise of the hide and tallow trades in both California and Hawaii. Ryan, would you tell us about that trade and when it started?
So hides are useful as, the basic source of leather goods. Tallow, which is the rendered fat, like I mentioned, can be used to make candles. And there's actually a really big market for these candles in the silver mines of Peru because, they're going into the dark mining tunnels, and so they need candles. So both of these goods are valuable and becoming increasingly valuable as we get into the 18 teens. The other thing that's happening in the 18 teens is there are a wave of wars of independence as the Latin American nations break away from Spain. And when that happens, Mexico, for instance, becomes an independent nation in 1821, and that takes it out of Spanish trade restrictions, which allows them to sell hides and tallow on the global market without any restrictions on who they can sell to and what prices they can sell at. And one of the big sources of hides and tallow is in California, where you have all these cattle who have been herded in the missions, and their populations have grown over the years. So in 1821, actually, right as Mexico becomes independent, immediately you have English and American firms rushing into California and starting trade operations to sell hides and tallow, take the tallow off to Peru, take the hides to England and New England for leather working. So this becomes the dominant trade in California by the 1820s. And then it sort of makes its way into Hawaii as well. There are cattle in Hawaii, as we've been talking about. And Hawaii is actually part of the basic circuit to California. As people sail to California, Hawaii is a natural stop because of the ocean currents, basically. And so why not load up on some more hides and tallow? So Hawaii also gets drawn into this trade by the late 1820s and especially by the 1830s. So in the 1830s, this is really the dominant good in the Pacific are these cattle products. You have a very famous account. I don't know if it's as famous today as it was in the 19th century, but Richard Henry Dana's 2 years before the mast is this very high-selling travel narrative, sailing adventure book of a New England college student who decides to drop out and join a Pacific ship. And he gets involved in the hide and tallow trade. And so that helps to make this famous in the United States.
It sounds like there was a gold rush in California before the actual gold rush. Only the gold in the 1820s was cattle.
Yeah, California has a history of gold rushes, including the gold rush, but everything from hides and tallow might have been the first one, and then all the way up to Silicon Valley today. There's always a boom industry in California.
When you mentioned that Hawaii was part of this cattle trade and sailing to California, that's because the ships have to go around Cape Horn, right, around the tip of South America? So the currents would just take them to Hawaii first.
Right. There's sort of three major routes that people take to the Pacific, and Hawaii is a stop on all of them. So Hawaii, again, its position is perfect. If you're going from Europe or the East Coast of the United States to California or Oregon, you're probably going to go around Cape Horn, and you're probably going to stop in Hawaii after you've gone up north through the Pacific.
Was there an environmental impact in California and Hawaii as the demand for cattle, hides, and tallow increased?
Yeah, I think the cattle population is fluctuating a fair amount in both places, and the hide and tallow industry both increases the need to have a lot of cattle on hand, but it also increases the need to slaughter those cattle. In California, there are historians who argue that the missions basically transition to becoming ranchers, and they sort of lose interest in converting Indians, and they focus on entering into this international cattle economy. And so that's going to change their emphasis and increase the cattle population, increase the management of the cattle population. The impact seems to be bigger in Hawaii, where they actually do overhunt the cattle, sort of ironically, this animal that's sort of a pest to a lot of Hawaiians, of commoners, Hawaiian commoners who are trying to plant their crops. They actually overhunt it, and it sort of disappears, and suddenly they need it, Hawaiians need it, so they have to put another kapu on cattle in the 1840s because they've overhunted the animals. So, that loss of population is going to change, all of those environmental impacts that came with cattle.
Before we move into the time warp, I wonder if you could tell us how and when California and Hawaii would become part of the United States, just because their history for many of us is just outside of our traditional early American path.
California becomes part of the United States after the Mexican War. So through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ends the Mexican War in 1848. And 1848 is also when the gold rush begins. So California enters the United States as this sort of big center of gold production. So the cattle industry becomes a bit secondary because of that. But really, it's caught up in that whole story of manifest destiny that people like President James K. Polk really see California as valuable and want to bring it into the United States, and they more or less manufacture a war in order to do that. Hawaii, the story is more complicated. There's more and more influence of American business, which I argue is prompted by the hide and tallow trade. A lot of the early American businesses are these hide and tallow firms. And they have an increasing power over Hawaiian politics and the Hawaiian economy, and they draw Hawaii closer and closer to the American economy. Eventually, Hawaii switches away from cattle products and focuses more on sugar production as the 19th century goes on, and these sugar producers who are mostly American begin to have more and more power. Eventually, these Americans basically take over the country in 1893, although they've already taken many steps throughout the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. But in 1893, they take over, and then they ask for annexation to the United States. And then McKinley brings Hawaii in 1898. We get the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Might as well take Hawaii as well while we're at it.
Let's transition to the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Ryan, in your opinion, what might have happened if the environments in California and Hawaii had not been suitable for cattle? How would the lack of cattle have changed the history of these Pacific regions?
The first thing I would say is that it does kind of depend on why those environments aren't suitable for cattle. Again, these are pretty versatile animals. A lot of places where cattle don't do well are also places where Europeans don't do well, so very cold or very hot climates. So maybe if that were a factor, it would have restricted European colonialism in California and Hawaii. But to take the question, I think most fairly, if we say that there's some predator or some parasite that keeps cattle out of those places, but everything else is sort of the same, you would have had some pretty significant changes. I think the Spanish would have had a hard time establishing themselves in California. There probably would have been missions because, again, it's mostly geopolitical, strategic reasons that bring the Spanish to California, but I don't think they would have done well. And maybe that leaves California up for grabs. Maybe the English or the Americans have more power there sooner. It might look more like Oregon, the Oregon Territory, and be more dominated by the fur trade. A really bold prediction would be to say that the Russians take California, and I don't think that's entirely ridiculous. The Russians might have seen an opportunity if there wasn't a Spanish presence. They do try to colonize California with Fort Ross. It's a very small operation, but maybe it would have been bigger without the Spanish presence. No matter what, though, I do feel like that things that are happening in the United States would still bring the U.S. to California in the 1840s. and you still would have some sort of U.S. takeover. And I don't know whether the indigenous people, I think in some ways the California Indians would be better off, and they wouldn't have had the same impacts that came with the Spanish missions, which caused massive depopulation through disease, but also probably through some poor conditions within the missions. So the California Indian population would have been larger, probably, and hardier when the United States arrived, but they also would have had less exposure to European diseases and European colonialism. So maybe that would have made them more vulnerable in some ways. And the California Indians really do, during the gold rush, take a horrible, horrible hit from Americans who basically just go out and slaughter them. And that might have happened no matter what. In Hawaii, I think things would have taken a real bad turn for the Hawaiian government in the 1830s. Again, this is when Hawaii, competing in global markets, they go to cattle because they have a lot of debt. Early on, they're selling a lot of sandalwood to European traders, and they mostly use up that economic resource. And so cattle is something they turn to in the 1820s and 1830s to keep up their payments to all these different foreign traders. And without cattle, I think maybe they would have had a lot of trouble. They might have defaulted, had to default on some of these debts. There are European colonial powers who like to use debt as an excuse to take over other regions. This is a strategy that France is very often using. You can't pay your debts, we're going to have to take you over and improve your governance. And so maybe a country like France or England would have grabbed Hawaii earlier, and maybe there wouldn't have been as big an American presence there. Maybe it wouldn't be a state today because of that. And I don't know, again, whether this is good or bad for the indigenous people, I think is an interesting question. They would have lost their sovereignty sooner, I'm arguing, speculatively. But under American colonialism, they lose a lot. They lose all their land, basically, or almost all their land. And maybe under French or English colonialism, they wouldn't have lost so much. Maybe they would have had a route to some sort of indigenous independence in the 20th century that they're obviously not getting as an American state. So I think there's a lot of interesting ways in which things could have gone for both regions.
That's a really interesting answer, and it also shows just how hardy cattle are when we had to qualify how to answer it. So thank you for looking at it both ways and for underscoring the hardiness of the cattle.
Yeah, we think of them often as very dependent on us and maybe not the brightest animals, but the Spanish Longhorns were more independent than our modern cattle. And, they're also, one of the reasons they're so useful is that they do take relatively decent care of themselves.
What are you working on these days? What aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
I've been working on a project on California Indians and getting into more detail as to how they respond to the arrival of the Spanish. But the project I'm really working on, the one that's my top priority right now, is actually a Midwestern project. I'm looking at the Sauk and Meskwaki Indians, who are more commonly known as the Sac and Fox Indians, and the environmental adaptations that they made through a series of migrations that they went through in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. So they have to move from Michigan to Wisconsin to Illinois to Iowa and so on and so forth. And as they're moving, how do they adapt to that? What cultural changes, what strategic changes do they make in their societies? That's the question I'm really fascinated by right now.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how we can get in contact with you if we still have questions about cattle colonialism?
The University of Wisconsin River Falls History website is probably the best place to look. It's got a little bit of a bio, but it's got my email address, most importantly. I'm also on Twitter at Ryan Fischer 1050, and it's Fisher with a C. I don't tweet enough, though. I should tweet more.
You should tweet more. I'm always on Twitter. I love Twitter.
Yeah.
Ryan, thank you so much for showing us these different aspects of early American history. We don't typically think of the Pacific region, and yet it has a very real early American history. So thank you for showing that to us.
Well, thank you for having me. It was great.
Wow. Who knew that cattle linked the early histories of California and Hawaii? I really enjoy learning about environmental history because it enlarges our view of the past. It reminds us that humans interacted with the land and that the land affected the ways that early American peoples lived and acted. Ryan's investigation of cattle culture in 18th and 19th century California and Hawaii illustrates this for us. Neither California nor Hawaii had cattle prior to their contact with Europeans. When Europeans brought cattle to both locations, native peoples had to figure out how to live with these new animals and how to take care of them. They also had to adapt their ways of life to compensate for the cattle because the Spanish longhorns altered the landscapes of California and Hawaii. They introduced new plant species, and those species took hold and eliminated other indigenous plants. The European introduction of cattle changed the way that people in California and Hawaii interacted with the land. If you would like more information about Ryan, his book Cattle Colonialism, or if you'd like to contact Ryan, you should visit the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/067. If you love Ben Franklin's World and would like to find out how you can help support the show and its goal to restore history to the forefront of the public mind, you should text Support BF World to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement. These actions will get you more information about our crowdfunding campaign and the financial and non-financial ways that you can help support this podcast. Finally, how many states have you visited? Hawaii is one of the 9 states I have left to visit, and I'm really lucky because Tim and I are going to Hawaii in April. We're going to spend our vacation with a couple of our best friends on Kauai and Oahu. I love visiting different states in the United States because they're all a little bit different from each other. Even states in a cohesive region like New England are a bit different from each other, and some states are dramatically different from each other. I just love the cultural and environmental diversity of the United States, and I can't wait to check Hawaii off my list. Let me know how many states you have visited or which states are on your wish list to visit. Send an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.